I met my husband at a conference on cognitive behavioral therapy. He was one of the few people in the room who didn't try to impress anyone, which ironically made him stand out. 2 years later, we were married. It all happened quickly, perhaps too quickly. But I was at that age where people stop asking when you're getting married and start wondering if you ever will. He told me about his son in passing, like one might mention a distant relative who occasionally calls on holidays. He's stubborn. Thinks he knows everything. Always does whatever he wants, he once said, his tone caught somewhere between frustration and indifference. I didn't push for more. At the time, I assumed the details would come later, with time and comfort. But they never did. His son, my stepson, had lived in a dorm ever since starting university, ironically at the same university where I taught. But our paths hadn't crossed. Or if they had, we never noticed. I had only seen him in a few family photos, the kind that stayed tucked into the corner of a bookshelf. He wasn't at our wedding. My husband said he was too busy. That should have been a red flag. I'm not sure when I started thinking about him more than I should have. Maybe it was during my lectures on developmental psychology, when I described the effects of parental neglect or unresolved father-son conflict. Sometimes, I'd catch myself wondering, was I unconsciously speaking about my own family? He was 20 now, a man in the eyes of the law, but still only on the threshold of adulthood. I didn't even know what he studied. Every time I brought him up, my husband dismissed the conversation like a fly buzzing around his head. He's fine. He's just difficult, he'd say, pouring himself another glass of wine. But I noticed how his jaw tightened whenever his son's name came up. How he never shared a single proud story, no funny anecdotes from childhood, no remember when he was little kind of warmth. There was only silence, and silence, I've learned, is often the loudest signal of all. As a psychologist, I've always believed that behavior speaks louder than words. That emotions buried too long find strange ways of surfacing. Maybe that's why I couldn't stop thinking about my stepson, not out of maternal duty, but out of something deeper. Something closer to obsession, if I'm honest with myself. One evening, after a particularly long day of student consultations, I came home to find my husband sitting on the porch, staring blankly into the darkening sky. His tie was loose, his shirt wrinkled. He looked more tired than usual. "Long day?" I asked. "Always is," he replied, but his voice was distant. I sat beside him, the breeze warm against my skin. For a while, we didn't speak. The quiet between us had started to feel more natural than conversation. Then I asked softly, "Do you ever talk to your son anymore?" His body stiffened. "What's the point?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" "He doesn't want anything to do with me. He's changed. Thinks he knows better than everyone. Especially me." There it was again, the bitterness. The blame. And yet, no explanation. "Maybe he just needs someone to listen to him," I suggested gently. He turned to look at me then, his eyes sharp. "And what makes you think you can fix what I couldn't?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have a response, but because I suddenly realized I wasn't trying to fix him. I was trying to understand him, and perhaps that made all the difference. That night, I went to bed restless. I dreamt of unfamiliar corridors, echoing footsteps, and shadows that vanished whenever I tried to look directly at them. I woke up with a name in my mind, a name I barely knew. Luca, my stepson. What was it about him that unsettled my husband so deeply? What was it that made me so curious, so unable to let the thought of him go? I didn't know then that the answer would find me sooner than I expected, in the least likely place of all, on the campus I thought I knew so well. But not yet. For now, all I had were questions, and an unshakable sense that something was waiting just beyond the surface. Something I was not yet meant to understand. The start of a new semester always carried a familiar energy, eager students, the scent of fresh paper and too much cologne, half-finished coffee cups clutched in anxious hands. I'd grown used to this routine. It felt predictable, even comforting, until I saw his name. I was reviewing my student rosters in the department office, scrolling through the list for my Tuesday through Thursday Psychology 101 class, when I froze. Luca Hayes. I stared at the screen, my fingers still on the keyboard, suddenly cold. Hayes, my husband's last name. My stepson. For a moment, the room felt distant, like I was watching it through fogged glass. Conversations continued around me, the low hum of academic chatter and the buzz of the printer. But all I could see was that name, a name that shouldn't have been there. He was in my class. Of all the sections, of all the schedules, this was the one fate, or irony, had chosen. I closed the laptop slowly. My heart beat faster than it should have. Why hadn't my husband mentioned this? Did he even know? Did Luca request my class intentionally, or was it just a coincidence? The rest of that day passed in a blur. Meetings, emails, coffee I didn't taste. And that night, as I stood in front of my closet, choosing what to wear for the next morning's lecture, I caught myself lingering. Not just lingering, obsessing. Pulling out one blouse, then another, running my hands over fabrics, holding them up against the light like I was going on a first date. I told myself it was silly. But I still picked the blouse that fit just right, and a skirt I hadn't worn since last spring, the one that hugged me without being obvious. Something professional, but flattering. And for the first time in a very long time, I wanted to impress someone. The following morning, I walked into the lecture hall a few minutes early. The familiar sounds of shuffling notebooks, half-whispered conversations, and music leaking from earbuds filled the space. And then I saw him. Fourth row, by the aisle. Luca. He was leaning back slightly in his chair, a notebook open in front of him, one hand resting casually on the desk. His face was calm, unreadable. The same eyes from the family photo in the hallway, but older now. Sharper. There was a stillness about him, a quiet confidence that didn't belong to a typical college sophomore. He didn't glance up at me right away, didn't whisper to the student next to him. He was just there. Composed. Present in a way that felt unnervingly self-aware. My voice caught for a second as I greeted the class. "I'm Dr. Monroe," I said. "Welcome to Introduction to Behavioral Psychology." Luca didn't react. No flicker of recognition, no smirk. Just steady eyes that eventually slowly met mine. It was like looking into water that ran deep and silent. I didn't know if he recognized me, but I knew in that moment. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't like the boys who tossed glances and compliments my way when they thought I couldn't hear. The ones who whispered things like, "She's actually kinda hot for a professor," as if that were praise. Luca was different. He didn't need to say anything. There was something in his posture, the way he held his pen, the slight narrowing of his eyes when I spoke. He listened. Not like a student, like an equal, or worse, like someone who saw through me. And every time our eyes met, I felt the shift. I had taught hundreds of students over the years. I had seen every type, overachievers, skeptics, charmers, the ones who dozed off in the back. But Luca didn't fit any of those molds. He wasn't trying to stand out. He already did. By the end of class, I realized how often I had looked his way. How often I'd caught myself wondering what he thought, not about the material, but about me. The room emptied slowly. Students filed out, some stopping to ask questions or offer shy smiles. Luca was one of the last to leave. As he passed my desk, he paused. Not long, just enough. Then he looked at me, and there it was again, that same quiet depth, that unsettling calm. Then he turned and walked away, his backpack slung over one shoulder, leaving me standing there with the strange realization that the ground beneath my feet had just shifted. And I wasn't sure where it would lead. The morning of the second lecture came with a low fog that clung to the city like a secret. I stood in front of the mirror longer than I had any right to. It wasn't about vanity, at least not entirely. It was about presence, about control. I chose a dark green blouse this time, one that brought out the richer tones of my eyes, paired with soft gold earrings and a sweep of mascara I usually reserved for evening events. I told myself it was just professionalism being polished, being put together. But deep down, I knew it was because I'd be standing in front of him again. The lecture hall was already half full when I arrived. I placed my bag on the desk and began setting up, laptop, clicker, handouts, my well-worn notebook filled with lecture notes and observations from years of teaching. Everything felt heavier that morning, though I hadn't brought more than usual. Or maybe it was the anticipation that weighed me down. When Luca walked in again, fourth row, same seat, he didn't look at me right away. But I felt his presence settle into the room like a new frequency. My breath caught for the briefest moment, but I pressed forward, launching into the lecture on classical conditioning, Pavlov, and the boundaries between response and reflex. Midway through, I glanced toward him while explaining a concept. He met my gaze just for a second and tilted his head, not in confusion, but like he was challenging me to go deeper. It was unnerving how seen I felt. By the end of class, the room began to buzz with movement. Backpacks zipping, chairs scraping, students filing out with half-written notes and half-hearted waves. I had too many things. I always did this. Overprepared, overpacked, overbooked. My arms were full with textbooks, a stack of graded papers, a laptop bag slung awkwardly over one shoulder. I was trying to gather everything neatly when I felt a shift near the desk. I looked up. Luca was standing there. He didn't say anything. He just held out his hand toward the heaviest of the stacks, textbooks and notebooks. Not forceful, not overeager, just calm, certain, quietly present. I blinked. Thank you, but He tilted his head slightly, not quite a smile, not quite a challenge. It's fine, he said, his voice even but warm. I've got it. I handed him the stack. It felt oddly intimate, the exchange, like handing someone something fragile. His fingers brushed mine for a second too long. I told myself it was nothing, just proximity. We walked in silence down the hallway, students passing us, some offering polite nods. Luca walked beside me, not behind, not ahead, as though we had always done this. I didn't know you were taking psych, I said lightly, breaking the silence. He glanced over at me. I didn't either. Not until the first class. So he hadn't registered knowing I'd be his professor. That ruled out one theory. But not the tension that clung to the space between us. You're good at it, I added. Attentive. His eyes flickered, like the compliment surprised him. It's interesting, he said. The way people work. The way they hide things. That answer sat between us for a beat too long. We reached my office, and I fumbled for the keys, suddenly more nervous than I should have been. He stood beside me quietly, waiting, not fidgeting, not impatient. I opened the door, stepped inside, and set my things down. He placed the books gently on my desk. Here. Thank you, I said again, softer this time. He paused before leaving. You don't talk about your husband. The question wasn't spoken, but I heard it in the way he said you. I turned toward him, surprised by the sudden shift in air. I try to keep personal life and work separate, I replied carefully. He nodded. Makes sense. And then, just like that, he turned and walked away, back down the hall, back into the fog. But something had shifted. Not a word out of place. Not a line crossed. And yet, as I stood there in my office, staring at the books he had carried, I felt the ripple of something I couldn't yet define. Not attraction. Not yet. But a knowing. A recognition. And I wasn't sure what to do with it. I tried to forget how it felt to walk down that hallway beside him. I tried to forget the way his voice lingered when he said you. Like the word held layers he didn't say aloud. I told myself that the flicker in his eyes meant nothing. That it was just courtesy, just civility. But the next lecture came, and with it, more glances. More stillness in the air when I spoke. More moments when our eyes met, and I forgot what came next in my notes. Luca never spoke during class. He didn't raise his hand, didn't banter like some of the bolder students did. But he listened deeply, intently. Not like he was learning facts, but like he was learning me. After that afternoon when he carried my books, I began noticing small things. The way he lingered slightly after each lecture, like he was waiting to be the last one out. The way he watched my hands when I gestured. The way he sat, poised, but never tense. Present. One Thursday, after a particularly long class, I was gathering my notes when I heard his voice again. Low, calm. Can I ask you something? I looked up. He was standing there, backpack still slung over his shoulder, eyes steady on mine. Of course. He glanced around, making sure the room was empty. I was wondering if you'd be willing to help me prepare for the midterm. One-on-one. I think I understand most of it, but I'd rather not guess. I hesitated, not because it was inappropriate. Students asked for help all the time. But something in the way he said it, it wasn't nervous. It was intentional. Like he knew what asking meant. I'm available most evenings, I replied carefully. You'd need to come to my office, though. He nodded. That works. A pause. Monday? I cleared my throat. Monday. That Monday, the hallway outside my office was unusually quiet. Most faculty had gone home. I had dimmed the harsh overhead lights and turned on my desk lamp instead, the room warm and soft with golden light. Outside, the autumn evening had slipped into that in-between moment, where dusk and night trade places in silence. I almost didn't hear the knock. Luca stepped inside, wearing a charcoal hoodie and jeans. Casual, but not careless. His hair was slightly damp, like he'd showered before coming over. His eyes scanned the room, bookshelves, framed degrees, soft lighting, and landed on me. Nice office, he said. Thanks. It's more peaceful than it looks during the day. I motioned toward the extra chair across from my desk. He sat down, pulling out a notebook and pen. We began with the basics, conditioning, reinforcement models, the early theorists. He listened quietly, asking a question now and then. But the questions weren't superficial. He didn't just want definitions. He wanted meaning. Why do people ignore logic even when the truth is in front of them? He asked after a while, pen still in hand but unmoving. I looked at him. He wasn't talking about theory anymore. Because emotion always arrives first, I said slowly. Logic has to catch up. And sometimes it never does. He nodded slightly. A shadow passed across his expression, and then it was gone. We kept going. But as we did, something shifted. The air thickened. His questions became slower, his gaze less guarded. And I, despite everything I knew, despite every lecture I'd ever given on boundaries and roles, let the distance between us narrow. At one point, he leaned forward, studying the diagrams I'd sketched. His arm brushed mine barely. Just a whisper of contact. But it was enough to make my pulse skip. You have good handwriting, he said softly. I don't know why I noticed that. I laughed quietly, trying to deflect the warmth crawling at my neck. I'm a professor. It's part of the job description. No, he said. It's more than that. His tone wasn't flirty. It wasn't bold. It was quiet, honest. We finished the session in a kind of suspended calm, like the room itself had agreed to hold its breath. When he stood to leave, I walked him to the door, more out of instinct than necessity. He paused just outside, hand on the edge of the frame. I'm glad it's you, he said, not quite looking at me. I frowned, confused. What do you mean? He met my eyes then, and the weight of it settled in my chest. You. Teaching this class. And then he walked away, leaving me alone in the doorway, watching him disappear into the soft blue evening, knowing full well that whatever this was had already begun. I hadn't told my husband about the extra sessions with Luca. Not exactly. I said I'd seen his son at one of my lectures. That was true. I even added that Luca seemed more focused than I expected. Also true. My husband didn't ask for details. He rarely asked about anything to do with his son. There was a wall between them, and he'd long since stopped pretending to care if it ever came down. And maybe that was the moment I stopped pretending, too. Our second one-on-one session was scheduled for Friday afternoon. I left campus early that day to change before Luca arrived. I didn't know why I cared so much, only that I did. I chose a fitted blouse that sat just right at the curve of my waist and dabbed my favorite perfume at the base of my neck. The scent was subtle, elegant, floral, just enough to linger. I was nervous, and I hated that I was. But I also knew I wasn't going to stop this from unfolding. When Luca arrived, something about him looked more composed than usual. As if he'd anticipated this moment, too. He sat closer this time. Our chairs just a breath apart, and I didn't ask him to move. We went through the materials slowly, less focused on the structure of the exam and more on the meaning behind each concept. But about halfway through, I closed the notebook between us and looked at him carefully. "Can I ask you something personal?" I said. He didn't hesitate. "Yes." I studied his face, so still, so composed. "Your relationship with your father. I get the feeling it's complicated." His gaze didn't drop. If anything, he looked more directly at me. "He doesn't listen," Luca said flatly. "He talks, gives orders, critiques. But he doesn't hear me. He never really has." There was a weight behind those words, years of it. I wanted to reach out and take that weight from him, piece by piece. "And your mom?" I asked gently. He paused. "Left. When I was a kid." I don't remember her well, but I remember her leaving. I felt something crack open inside me. He wasn't just guarded. He was fractured in ways he had learned to hide. He carried himself like a man, but I could see now no one had ever given him the space to feel safe, to be heard. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "You didn't deserve that." He looked at me for a long moment. "I know." Something passed between us then. Not words, not silence, just understanding. As the session came to a natural pause, I began to gather my things. Luca stood slowly, like he wasn't ready to leave. Then he offered quietly, "Let me walk you home." I hesitated. "No," I said, just as quietly. "Let's go to a bar instead." He blinked. "What?" I smiled at his surprise. "Someplace nearby. I don't want to go home. And I'd rather not stop talking." He watched me for a beat, then nodded. "Okay." We found a place just off campus. Dimly lit, tucked between a bookstore and a florist. It was the kind of place where no one paid attention, except that wasn't our luck that night. Not long after we sat down, I spotted them. 3 of my students, his classmates, sitting across the room, just close enough to recognize me. One of them nudged the other, whispering behind her glass, eyebrows raised. I felt Luca notice it too. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "They've seen us." He turned slightly, just enough to glance over his shoulder. Then he straightened, calm, composed. "So?" I held his gaze. "You don't mind?" He shrugged. "I'm not doing anything wrong." And somehow, the way he said it made it feel true. We stayed. We talked. More deeply than before. We didn't speak like student and professor. We spoke like 2 people who had been orbiting the same ache. The same need to be seen. To be understood. I felt his eyes on me more than once. Intense, lingering. Like he was memorizing my every expression. It should have made me uncomfortable. It did. But not in the way it should have. Eventually, I couldn't bear the weight of it anymore. The heat of his attention, the way it settled on my skin. I stood silently, slowly, and walked toward the back exit, pushing open the door that led to the quiet yard behind the bar. The air was cool outside, the night ink-black and thick with unsaid things. I didn't hear him follow me. I felt him. He came up behind me quietly, footsteps soft on the gravel. He stopped just close enough for me to sense him, but not close enough to touch. I turned slowly. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. And then he stepped forward. One step. Two. And kissed me. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't uncertain. It was quiet, certain, and impossibly gentle. His hand came up to the side of my face, the warmth of his palm grounding me in the reality of what we were doing, what we had already done. I didn't pull away. I didn't speak. I let it happen, because for the first time in years, I didn't want to be anywhere else.